The Barbary Wars are an often overlooked conflict in both American and world history. They marked a major stand against Islamic piracy in the 19th century, which many have likened to the War on Terror today. The pirates in question operated out of the Barbary coast, dually holding meaning as both the barbarian coast by some European nations, as well as being named after the primary inhabitants of the region, that being the Berbers, whose name also happens to derive from an old word for barbarian. The Berbers are an indigenous ethnic group native to North Africa who live a mostly tribal life. However, following both Roman rule and Arabization of the region, many Berbers, especially those situated on the coast, now carry with them a hefty blend of Arab genetic admixture, with fluctuations toward European or African DNA based on how far north or south you go. One might liken the spread of Islam to North Africa to the spread of Christianity in Europe, dramatically replacing the tribal practices of the native people and instituting a new cultural order. However, unlike in Europe where the faith spread quickly and thoroughly, because of the mountains and deserts of North Africa, pockets of tribal Berber culture managed to survive and exist in long competition with the now Islamic Arab Berbers, who went on to dominate the major North African coastal cities, around which most civilization arose, leaving the traditional Berbers confined to either mountain farming in isolated areas or living nomadically. An arrangement which, paired with the fact that most of North Africa is encompassed by the Sahara Desert, has made long-term stable government a great challenge. Though it was during the Barbary Wars that the region known as the Barbary Coast achieved a strange level of cooperation that hadn't really been seen since the days of Carthage, and may not have even been seen since. In North Africa, major coastal cities served as primary hubs of operation for pirates, particularly the cities of Tangiers, Tripoli, Algiers, and Tunis, with Tripoli serving as the unofficial capital of the greater Barbary Coast, which at the time was still technically part of the Ottoman Empire, however, for most intents and purposes, remained generally autonomous. The Barbary pirates terrorized and even dominated the Mediterranean Sea at one point, capturing European ships from countries which refused to pay protection money, and oftentimes even plundering compliant ships regardless. All valuables on board would be seized, including the crew itself, European Christians being prime targets for the Arab slave trade, especially nobles who could be ransomed for a hefty price. Those unlucky enough to not be ransomed would find themselves at the mercy of their new holders, who had been infamous for their brutality, punishing disobedience and disrespect with severe bodily harm and even death. Some Europeans who had converted or willingly lent their support to the pirates shared with their new allies European-level shipbuilding and weapons crafting techniques, which made them all the more formidable. This pillaging, slave trading, and ransoming had the side effect of generating great amounts of much-needed wealth for the sanctuary cities, which these pirates operated out of. The Ottomans somewhat neglected their North African lands, really only desiring them to ensure the European powers wouldn't claim them. All the while, difficult terrain and general disunity forced the Ottomans to make the region mostly self-governing. The region territories were still forced to pay tribute to the Ottoman Sultan, while trade revenue too was siphoned off by the larger empire. This is very much the same story seen by Caribbean colonies in the post-privateering era: great isolation, imperial neglect, and little opportunity to develop. The answer was to welcome and house out-of-business pirates who needed a place to hide and spend their loot. For the Barbary Coast, this brought its cities closer together as the pirates formed an interlocking community between them based on a similar economic style, common Islamic practice, and reliable power structure, forming the basis for an unofficial state with a similar hierarchy to feudal Japan, the regional bey or governors filling the role of lords, and the pirates as a noble warrior class much like the samurai. Eventually, the pirates' reach extended beyond the Mediterranean Sea and spread widely across the Atlantic, reaching as far as the coasts of Brazil and Iceland. Quite soon, raids became no longer exclusive to ships, and any coastal city within the pirates' range was at threat, most especially for the Mediterranean countries, but again affecting nations as far away as Britain and even Iceland. Iceland having seen 900 citizens snatched away from their homes over the course of only 2 raids. The pirates' downfall came as a result of the international enemies it had made. Wars in Europe forced regular naval patrols which reduced the threat of pirate attack, and as time moved forward the navies of Europe outpaced those of the pirates, who were mostly dependent on the technological advances of the Ottoman Empire. The end finally came when the still young US was provoked into action by repeated pirate attacks and demands for higher and higher protection fees. The US at the time had no navy and thus rapidly constructed a team of massive frigates. Only 6 of these ships were planned for construction along with a few publicly funded vessels, but with the attachment of over 30 heavy guns and a balance of both size and speed, it was believed these would be sufficient for defensive purposes. Because the US was still a young nation and was engaging an enemy in a far-off land, the first few skirmishes of the Barbary War were somewhat inconclusive, with one of the US ships even being captured by the pirates, but then being destroyed by the US to prevent its design from being repurposed. Eventually, the war did end with peace being drawn between the US and Barbary Coast, restricting the imposition of protection fees and forcing the coast to crack down on piracy. The decades which followed would see Europe reach a level of naval superiority, which left the pirates an essential non-threat, while at the same time the European colonization of Africa and the imposed abolition of the slave trade would mark the absolute end of the Barbary pirates. But what if it didn't? In our world, after getting the USS Philadelphia stuck, Captain William Bainbridge, out of fear that the pirates would turn the warship against American forces, tossed every gun and supply barrel overboard and attempted to sink the ship itself. And while the guns were disposed of, it was captured before it could be sunk. In this alternate world, Bainbridge doesn't even get the chance to disarm the ship, and the pirates now have at their disposal not only a weapon capable of deterring the remaining American attack, but access to knowledge of how the ship was built and a means of producing more. It was very rare that the pirates would have the opportunity to capture a naval ship, especially one so large and well armed. The US had actually gone the extra mile in its design, thanks to a plentiful supply of lumber, which will likely be a primary hindrance for the pirates in their reconstruction, but nothing a whole lot of loot can't fix. The pirates would most certainly attempt to reproduce the American ship. The Barbary pirates tended to use small but speedy vessels to surprise merchant ships and take off quickly. Oftentimes the raided ship itself wasn't even worth stealing, since it was easily traceable and tough to sell off. But with a bigger, stronger ship that still packs a lot of speed, this could make the pirates more ambitious and perhaps even attempt to capture other Navy vessels. It's probably not the safest idea, but hey, for a bigger risk you get a bigger payoff. It would become increasingly necessary to pack some heavier firepower, as the wars in Europe turned most of the surrounding waters into a militarized zone. The pirates would continue to raid, gradually building their own makeshift navy operating along the Barbary coast alongside Ottoman vessels. Otherwise, nothing really changes until 1830, when the restored Bourbon monarch King Charles of France sets about a plan to end the Barbary slave trade for good. There had been an earlier dispute between Algeria and France over something pretty minor called the Fan Affair, where the Algiers leader Hussein Dey struck a French consulate with his fan because France refused to pay some merchants money. It's kinda silly, but the point is it led France to blockade Algiers, Algiers to fire warning shots at the French ships after 3 years of failed negotiations to lift the blockade, and France to ultimately invade and conquer Algeria for their acts of aggression. This time things are different. The 1800s weren't the best time for the Ottoman Navy, let alone its regencies, so when the French Navy approached the shores of Algiers, there was little to stop them. But this time there is. The pirates, who you might argue held no loyalties to their cities, did rely upon the coast to maintain their livelihood. If the French invasion succeeded, it would spell the beginning of the end for piracy in the region. The French themselves had overestimated their opponents and generally agreed that if the beachfront couldn't be breached, then the invasion would be called off. This was especially true for the admiral put in charge of the naval invasion, Guy Victor Duperrey. Believing this move was simply too dangerous and not worth it. Because the pirates of this world are more well prepared to combat actual Navy vessels, they're forced to spring into action for the preservation of the pirate sanctuary. Much like with the US previously, the pirates put up just enough of a fight to coax a retreat from their opponents, and a victory is claimed. In our world, France's invasion set a precedent for the rest of Europe to exert influence over what was an unstable but highly strategic and profitable land. In this alternate timeline that never happens, the territory for now remains under the Ottoman banner, but that won't last for long. If in this world the Ottomans fail to properly defend Algiers from France, this compounded with their losing Greece in the War of Independence could cost them much respect in the eyes of the Algerian people, who hadn't been saved by the Ottomans, but by the pirates. The question is then of course raised, why even remain under Ottoman rule if they can't keep us safe? Surely the cities were growing tired of paying their tributes to the Turks, whose empire was clearly in a gradual decline, while the powers of Europe were on the rise. Though this invasion was repelled, it would not be the last, and so with the Ottomans incapable of protecting North Africa, the people would turn to the pirates. The regional governors would meet in Tripoli with the pirate captains and chiefs of select sympathetic Berber tribes for the establishment of a unified Barbary state. A new social order would need to be established to bring a greater cohesion to the widely distinct lifestyles of each group. It'd be settled for the establishment of a loose caste system of sorts, one in which the tribesmen are free to do as they wish within designated Berber zones under the protection of the government, so long as Islam remains their religion of practice, and all able-bodied men enlist in the reserve military. This caste would give the Berbers a stable homeland, but leave them as second-class citizens in the coastal areas. But this rank could be shed if the Berber tribesmen trade their old life to join a pirate crew, a group which would enjoy a special privilege along the coast, but would be forbidden from traveling to Berber territory to prevent domestic slaving. At the top of the hierarchy would be the Arab Berbers, especially those most strongly practicing the Islamic faith, a status that would be raised even higher if they were also a member of a pirate crew. Arab Berbers would overwhelmingly dominate the mechanisms of government, military, and information, making up an elite noble caste. Rogue tribes within Berber territory who refused to bend to the whims of the new state would be subjugated, arrested, and even enslaved to be used as laborers in the cities. If this breakaway from the Ottomans occurs sometime in the years immediately following the attempted French invasion, it could happen side by side the Egyptian-Ottoman Wars, or any number of the uprisings in the Balkans, confounding the situation for the Ottomans and making separation all the easier. The decades which followed would see the international demand for slaves decrease, though sale of European slaves could be made deeper into Asia and even neighboring Morocco, who the Barbary state would develop a closer friendship with, and encourage it to further support the pirates, who primarily used the Moroccan coast as a launching off point into the Atlantic. Conflicts occasionally flare up, especially with France, the Italian states, and Spain, whose turbulent condition at the time would leave it vulnerable to a number of land raids and occupations, which would go as far as to cost Spain the Canary Islands. Instability with Morocco's Berber population leads it to seek more reliable stability through a union with Barbary, forming what would come to be known as the Maghreb Empire, a mega country with a few major population centers littering the coast, and a vast sparsely occupied inland, which in most part went to the indigenous Berber tribes. Trade, both legal and not, would generate for the region a reputation and status as an economic empire, particularly favored by the new German Empire, whose geographic position in Europe hardly left it the victim of pirate attacks, while most every other European power developed a strong animosity with the country, potentially leaving most of Europe in a coalition against the Barbary Empire. The Kaiser, however, believes the Maghreb offers a great opportunity for Germany to gain an exclusive footing in North Africa, and in an event mirroring the first Moroccan crisis, the Kaiser travels to the region of Morocco in 1905 to negotiate and eventually declare publicly the German-Maghreb alliance, granting Germany access to major North African ports while providing to the pirates naval weaponry never before seen, triggering, as you could imagine, a series of bolder attacks on European ships, which ultimately pull the coalition and Germany into a great Barbary war. And that is where I'd like to end the video, but I'm sure you're all wondering who would win. Alright, so unlike in the Great War of our world, this early conflict may exclude Russia. There's no need to invade Serbia by this point since the Archduke wouldn't be assassinated for a few more years. However, Spain and Portugal are involved as they are likely heavily more impacted by the presence of the pirates right across the strait. Despite this, neither Spain nor Portugal could contribute all too significantly to the war effort, but in all fairness, neither might the Barbary state, unless either Germany somehow managed to rapidly militarize them, or even more unlikely unless the Maghreb was able to keep up with European advancement all these years. Realistically, the Maghreb would probably be in a more primitive state than Russia had been, yes, likely boasting a big population and lots of land from which to attack, but not quite the right tools to do so. Though regardless, Germany not needing to fight on two fronts would give it all the advantage necessary to overpower France. Meanwhile, the Barbary state could probably still invade Iberia and perhaps even Italy. As spoils of war, Barbary would claim any Spanish, Portuguese, and Italian islands in the Mediterranean, as well as neighboring French West Africa. Germany in turn could demand Portuguese, Italian, and even Belgian colonies in Africa to establish its Middle Africa Reich colony. So it's 1910, Germany basically won World War I, Russia hasn't gone communist, and piracy is still a thing. Worse yet, slavery may still carry on in North Africa, though perhaps pressures from the European powers or just the direction the world had been going could have led the practice to die out a bit earlier, but in all likelihood the continuity of piracy in the region would go hand in hand with the continuity of the Arab slave trade. However, eventually, much like had happened in Japan, the role of the pirates would need to come to an end. As Barbary develops a more legitimate role in the world and legitimate trade becomes a primary source of wealth, the old ways of piracy would slowly fade either naturally or through suppression. And that is where I'll end the video for now. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Support your Legion by liking the video or checking out our website usofz.com, and join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.